At the beginning of chapter 17, the monster has stopped his narration and we get to see Victor's response. He's confused. There's a sense that he doesn't know how to respond, and perhaps this mirrors our response as readers. Throughout the novel, Shelley plays with our sympathies with the monster. One minute we see him as a neglected and abandoned creature, desperate for love and acceptance, and the next he's portrayed as a demonic and brutal murderer of the innocent. Even his own narrative, which has just finished, leaves us unsure whether to respond with sympathy and pity on the one hand, or condemnation and revulsion on the other. It's his request for a female mate, which in particular leaves Victor in a state of confusion, saying, "The being finished speaking and fixed his looks upon me in the expectation of a reply. But I was bewildered, perplexed, and unable to arrange my ideas sufficiently to understand the full extent of his proposition." The monster seems to attempt to impose his will on Victor at this point, using the deontic modal verb must and the forceful verb demand, when he says, "You must create a female for me with whom I can live in the interchange of those sympathies necessary for my being. This you alone can do, and I demand it of you as a right which you must not refuse to concede." Let's just look for a moment at modal verbs briefly, just in case you want to use this term when analysing this passage in an exam. Modal verbs are verbs of possibility or likelihood or condition, like must, may, might, can, could, shall, should, will, would, or ought to. There are three types of modal verbs. Epistemic modal verbs are to do with the likelihood or possibility of something happening, like it might rain later or he could be in his bedroom. Deontic modal verbs are to do with permission or duty, so things like "please may I leave the room" or "you must arrive by 8 o'clock. Dynamic modal verbs are to do with your own internal ability, like "I can play the guitar" or "she could do a handstand when she was younger." So here, the monster definitely uses the deontic modal verb must twice when he's commanding Victor to provide him with a female companion. Is this the best strategy to use? Well, maybe not. Victor doesn't seem to like being bossed around. The power struggle between the two of them is something Shelley focuses on from their meeting onwards, with each of them seizing opportunities to impose their will on each other or deny the other their freedom, ambitions, or desires. What both of them perhaps seem to miss is their interdependence. Their fates are intertwined, so any power struggle between the two will ultimately be doomed to failure for both of them. The monster doesn't quite know how to play it, and this perhaps reveals his desperation for companionship. He's prepared to threaten, but if that doesn't work, well, he's prepared to reason. He's eloquent, articulate, and convincing as he explains why he believes Victor should form a companion for him. Victor seems to sway one way and the other, talking at times about the rage that burned within him, and on other occasions saying, "I felt there was some justice in his argument." The monster threatens Victor at times by saying, "I will work at your destruction, nor finish until I desolate your heart, so that you shall curse the hour of your birth." Really quite harsh, emotive language being used there. In the next breath, he displays a degree of self-control when he says, "I intended to reason. This passion is detrimental to me, for you do not reflect that you are the cause of its excess." It's a remarkable line. The creature shows here that he's capable of looking at the situation through Victor's eyes, recognizing Victor's inability to acknowledge his guilt, and then adjusting his argument and strategy accordingly. This isn't a monstrous beast. This is an astonishingly astute, perceptive, self-controlled being who's been abandoned, rejected, neglected, shunned, and physically assaulted. He's capable of ripping Victor to shreds, yet refrains. Ultimately, though, perhaps we need to ask why. Is this self-restraint noble and admirable, or does it stem from desperation? Victor, after all, is his only hope. Only Victor can create a female companion for him. It's selfishness which causes the monster to try reason rather than threats of violence. It's obsession with achieving his goal of escaping the isolation that has plagued him since his creation. Selfishness? Obsession? Have we heard those words before? Maybe the monster and Victor aren't as different as we might think. Is this another opportunity to consider them as parallels or Gothic doubles? The nature versus nurture debate is raised again in this chapter when the monster says, "I am malicious because I am miserable." It might be worth mentioning Jean-Jacques Rousseau, an 18th century philosopher, if you're talking about this theme in an exam. Rousseau wrote about the corrupting nature of society, and the monster certainly seems to gradually transform from a childlike being who naturally seeks to do good into a fiend-like murderer, embittered by his interactions with a civilized society. He's like a child craving attention, seeking significance and determined to impact others in some way, any way, when he says, "If I cannot inspire love, I will cause fear." He's very aware that his life could go in one of two directions. And I think he's also very aware that it's Victor who will determine this direction. Because when he finally convinces him to create the female monster, we're told he suddenly quitted me, fearful perhaps of any change in my sentiments. It's quite clever on the monster's part, really. He's realised how fickle Victor can be, so as soon as he gets his agreement, he's off.